Thank you, Wes, and happy birthday to Dave. As we prepare to come to the Lord's table together tonight, I wonder if we could turn to Mark chapter 3. This is a section that closes out chapter 3. I'll start reading from verse 20 there. If you've got a Bible, it'd be helpful to follow along. Mark 3, verse 20. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. Okay, first, a few verses back, we saw Jesus by the water, by the shore, with the big crowds. And then he went to the hills and with his disciples for some training and things. And now he's back in civilization, out of the wilderness. And again, and immediately, just like before, he is just surrounded by people. Have you ever been so busy that you didn't even have time to eat? Yeah. Well, Mark includes that subtle footnote to convey the intensity of Jesus' fame. We may not quite grasp how popular he was in this moment. He really was the Taylor Swift, Dwayne Johnson, Elon Musk of his day. He couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed. There were people all around him. They wanted to be with him all the time. He was followed wherever he went. And this extreme degree of notoriety is significant to everything that happens in this passage, okay? Verse 21, when his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. Out of his mind. Crazy, okay? How many of us have had family who think we're crazy? How many of us are crazy and have managed to keep it from our family? How many of us think we're normal because our whole family is crazy? Yeah. If we have been accused of being crazy, when it comes to Jesus, we're in good company. King Festus accused the Apostle Paul of that in Acts chapter 26. He said, Paul, your great learning is driving you mad. St. Francis of Assisi was charged with it. So was missionary William Carey. So, crazy is one thing. But crazy when it comes to doing God's will, that's something else. That adds a spiritual complexity that sometimes can be hard to figure out. Because there are, at times, like here with Jesus, there are times when God asks his servant, his child, to do something that seems totally loony to the unbelieving world around us. Coming to Wilmore, coming to Asbury for school or even to teach here at one of the schools here. Leaving another career to do so, especially. For some of us, that caused our family to think, oh, she's lost her mind. He's not thinking clearly. This is not a good idea. This is not sensible. This is not logical. We better jump in and save him. We have to save that boy. He's lost his marbles, bless his heart. If they'd been from the South, that's what they would have been thinking. Bless his heart. Well, same thing's happening here. This was an act of true compassion and care on behalf of Jesus' family. There's no doubt that they had heard, along with the rest of the people there, of what Jesus was saying, what he was doing, and they just did not get him. At least not his brothers. John 7, verse 5 tells us that plainly. His brothers didn't understand what he was doing. They probably also heard that the Pharisees and the scribes were coming to get him for what he was doing. They were out to take him out for the things that he was saying. So the combination of those things moved his family to do something to protect him, to save him from himself, to save him maybe from his own delusions. It's funny that they came to save the Savior. I just find humor in that. So Jesus' family is in the area, okay? And then come the scribes, or the teachers of the law. And they come with their own assessment of what's going on here. And it's worse than crazy. Verse 22, the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem said, he's possessed by Beelzebul. By the prince of demons, he's driving out demons. Now, being demon oppressed or possessed seems worse than merely crazy to us. Though in Jesus' world, they were often thought of as one and the same. I mentioned this moment last Sunday night as being the third time Mark mentions in a row Jesus and demons in context. The first time was Jesus' interaction with the demon itself in the middle of the crowd, back in verse 11. The next was Jesus giving his followers authority over demons up in verse 15. Here, Jesus is accused of being one, possessed by Beelzebul, which is the Greek word that the Jews had come to use to refer to the chief of demons or to Satan himself. Now, what's interesting about them calling Jesus that is that in doing so, they are acknowledging that there is definitely something powerful going on in or with Jesus. They realized, they had to admit that he was just not some nut who thinks he can heal people, like Jesus' own family probably thought. No, the religious leaders here, they are admitting that Jesus is doing genuinely powerful things. That's very interesting, which means, among other things, that the person today who questions or who doubts the validity of Jesus has to wrestle with this fact that Jesus' own enemies admitted that he was powerful in some unexplainable and otherworldly sort of way. How do you explain that? If you question Jesus, his enemies weren't going to lie for him. Somebody wondering about Jesus today has to wrestle with that fact. Here's how the scribes explained it. The scribes' problem or error was not their observation. They saw correctly that something was going on, and they never doubted that he was doing unusual things. The scribes' problem was in their explanation, their assessment that Jesus' power must be coming from the realm of evil. That was a convenient solution for them, since it would not only offer an explanation of his power, it would also provide them with an excuse to do anything they wanted to, get rid of him and destroy him. But their deduction, Jesus basically says, is actually completely illogical. It doesn't make any sense at all. Of all the charges of madness or craziness that were flying around here, if anything was truly crazy, it was this conclusion that the scribes come to regarding the miracles. That doesn't make any sense at all. Verse 23 there. Jesus called the scribes over to him, responding to them with an illustration, saying this, how can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom can't stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house can't stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he can't stand. And his end has come. You see the argument Jesus makes. If these healings and these exorcisms were taking place under Satan's power, then Satan is undoing his own work, which surely he would not do. Satan would never intentionally undermine himself. He would never intentionally undermine his power. He would never act in such a way that would bring division to his own cause. He'd be fighting with himself. He'd be shooting himself in the foot. And Satan is way, way smarter than to do something as illogical and self-destructive as that. He continues his logic in verse 27 there. He says, in fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. You see, if the evils and the injuries of this world were caused by Satan, which may be the one thing both Jesus and the scribes agreed on, then it only makes sense that the one correcting the evils and the healing and the injuries and healing the people's injuries, the one doing that would have to be stronger than the one who caused them. If you're going to take something that belongs to a strong man, you have to be stronger than he is. Which is exactly Jesus' point. One stronger than the devil is here. And he's bringing freedom and restoration to the world. He is undoing the evil that Satan has done. That's Jesus' very logical and very sensible explanation. But with that explanation comes a warning. Jesus says in verse 28 there, he says, "Truly I tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter. But whoever blasphemes the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. They are guilty of an eternal sin." He said this because they were saying, "He has an impure spirit." Okay, this concept of the eternal or unforgivable sin, just the thought of it, the thought that such a thing could exist, that has caused a lot of angst and consternation through the ages. If you rip it out of its context here, which people usually do, people have wondered very wordedly if they were close to committing it with this thought or this or that or whatever they did. I remember thinking that myself as a kid. I didn't even know what it was, but I wondered if I'd done it, you know. So what is it? The unforgivable sin. Basically, it's calling evil good and good evil. It's attributing to Satan work that the Spirit has done. It's getting those things completely turned backward. It's refusing to see Jesus' work in ministry as being rooted in the work of God. That's the blasphemy Jesus speaks of. Believing and saying that something good of God is something evil and of the devil. Stating that, really believing that, involves a moral obtuseness that is so deep and pervasive, it's not going to be changed. It's the conscious and deliberate rejection of the saving power of God, the rejection of God himself, which of course has the consequence of eternal condemnation. That is eternal separation from God, eternal damnation, hell, whatever you want to name it, however you want to think about it. That is the consequence of unforgiven sin. That the heart closed to God will suffer. And Jesus knew that the scribes were well on their way toward that place. He saw that in their eyes. He heard it in their comments. He understood it. So his warning here is stern. There's no doubt about that. But it's still a warning of grace, as all of his warnings are. Whether or not we choose to heed them, that's our business and our problem if we don't. Okay, then, after all of this stuff unfolds, verse 31 there, then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and brothers?" Jesus asked. And then he looked at those seated in a circle around him, and he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." Now, I intentionally wanted to include those last few verses in this same message as verse 21, where we're told that Jesus' family had come to take charge of him because they thought he was literally beside himself or not thinking correctly or mad or crazy. Okay? Here's why I wanted to include this. If one reads all of this as one unit, one might be tempted to think that Jesus' words here at the end about family were a sort of offended retaliation to Jesus' family coming to take charge of him. You see? Sort of they think I'm crazy, do they? Well, I'll just gonna reject them right back, right here. Now, that may be something that we would do or we would be tempted to do. But that cannot be so about Jesus. That whole chip on the shoulder, I'll show you kind of retaliatory attitude, that just flies in the face of God's character. God does not call people names. Remember that when you vote for president. God does not call people names. God does not react unkindly and viciously out of hurt and out of emotion. That is not Jesus' way. If it was, he would have done that a little while before when the scribes accused him of being the devil. I mean, if you're given to reacting emotionally, someone calling you the devil gives you plenty of opportunity to do that. But Jesus did not. Instead, he very calmly laid out a logical argument that showed them their mistake. So no, this here was not any sort of emotional, retaliatory strike by Jesus toward his family, okay? What it was, though, was no less shocking, and especially so in his culture. Now, we Americans, and really just about everyone who lives in the global West, most of us will not quite feel the shock of what Jesus is saying here because of how we understand family, culture, mobility, society, the way that we have been raised. As children in the West, in the global West, as children grow up and go to school or to work, and they marry and they have families and they take careers, hopefully listening to God's leading as they do, most of us expect our kids to not wind up living close by us, near family. And so they go off to whatever school or career or calling, wherever they go, and they go there and they develop a circle of friends. Again, hopefully they're connected to Christ. And they wind up spending much more time with them than with parents or with their siblings. Broadly speaking, I know it's true, that's not true for everybody. Broadly speaking, that's the norm of the Western culture. But in Jesus' world, a life like that was absolutely scandalous. In Jesus' world, the family bond was tight, and the family bond was lifelong. What was normal in his time, and is still normal in many parts of our world, was for children to live as close to their parents as possible, often in the same house. And often that family unit would also function as a business unit. They'd work together at a common trade or at a farm or something like that. So they shared everything in common. They stuck together. So for Jesus to declare what he does here is bad enough, culturally speaking. Okay? But for the Jewish culture in particular, loyalty to family was also spiritual. Breaking that family tie undermined a major pillar in the way Jews thought. And the way Jews still think today about the world and about themselves. But regardless of all that, Jesus says what he says. He upends this expectation. And he does so largely in the name of identity. Identity. You see, in his culture, and to Jews especially, your family was your identity. Right here, Jesus was breaking this cultural norm by saying that we are to follow him. Our identity must be in him and in him alone if we are to be his disciple. Our loyalty to Jesus must come before loyalty to anything or anyone else, including family, and even ourselves, and our own ideas and our own plans, if we are really to be his disciple. Jesus said it a different way in Luke chapter 14. You remember it. Whoever comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, his brothers and sisters, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. What's Jesus mean by that? Well, in the Luke passage there, Jesus follows this with a story about a man who tried to build a house without counting the cost, and he winds up leaving it unfinished because he's not able to pay the cost. That is the point that he is applying to our relationship with family and with him. There's a cost to be counted in order to follow Jesus. It's not that we coldly or heartlessly reject our biological family or our heritage, and we certainly don't treat them cruelly or disrespectfully, and we don't neglect our family duties. But what Jesus is saying is, when push comes to shove, our loyalty must be to him above everybody else. That is the cost of following him. We must ultimately do as God says, and not as family expects when those things come into conflict. Now again, this does not hit us nearly as hard as it did his original hearers here. But just the same, Jesus, in setting this standard, is cutting through an entire traditional loyalty structure with one slice. Actually, Jesus is doing nothing less here than beginning a new family structure. A new holy people that regard even ties that used to bind as now subservient to God's will. At this point in their life, Jesus' biological family did not understand who he really was yet. So, of course, they thought all he was doing and all he was saying was crazy. They wanted to just get him and shake him back into his right mind and, get things back to normal. So Jesus had to let them know that this was the new normal for him and for anybody else who would follow him. He wasn't coming up with all this stuff on his own, and it wasn't due to demons. This was all the will of God. The teaching, the healing, the reordering of priorities and cultural expectations and mores. It was all part of this new kingdom, God's kingdom, being birthed into existence. He was giving it birth right here. And everybody knows that wherever new things are born, things change. Old normals are upended, and stuff can get messy. And the new normal comes just the same. Some in Jesus' family, including his mother Mary and his brother James, some of them, they came to see this eventually. We learn later. And even a few of those Jewish religious leaders, it seems over time, came to grasp this and accept what Jesus was doing because they realized who he was and what he was saying was right. He was cutting new ground here in order to build something that reaches, you see, all the way down to us. As Christian brothers and sisters, following Jesus together, defending each other, understanding one another as even some of our own biological family cannot understand. And then coming around his table together as family. First here, sort of in practice runs, but one day we will be with him in glory at his table. Following Jesus has to take the top priority, because that is the tie that binds us to God for eternity. Family ties don't do that. Our tie with Jesus is the only thing that will. After I gave my heart to Jesus in college, my freshman year, when that happened, things changed in my life. The ways I used my time and my money and my talents, they changed. My roommate and I, we were friends in high school and we went to school together. But then, rather suddenly, and then in an ongoing way, we didn't have quite as much in common. And we didn't have quite as much to talk about like we used to. My parents, they'd never seen behavior like that from me before. I was going to Campus Crusade stuff. I was going to meetings. I was going to Bible studies. I was going to training events. I was witnessing to people on campus. I didn't come home at school breaks. I went to crusade retreats and to conferences, even a summer project. I was gone the first summer after being at college. I changed so much that my mom called a Free Methodist pastor in Kent, Ohio, to check on me, to see if I'd lost my mind. See if I was beside myself, since she never heard of Campus Crusade. Crew is what they call it today. She was a church-going believer, but not like this. She wasn't like this. Frederick Grant writes, he says, in the church, those that hear God's call to himself have to engage in one of life's hardest battles, not out of hate, but out of love. It's a battle against the mistaken enclosures which sometimes make family barricades a hazard to a life service for Christ. True family affection should be an incentive of service for Christ and not a substitute for it. A family should be a harbor from which the ship leaves to sail the seas and not a dock where it ties up and rots. Loyalties have to change with priorities, you see, or neither wind up being worth very much in the end. Jesus demands our absolute loyalty. He died to make us part of his family, to give us a seat at his table. So there's no question that he has the privilege of demanding that. I wonder, as we come around the table, I wonder if we might all think together, is there something or someone standing between you and Jesus tonight? Some priority, some attitude, maybe some loyalty. Have you ever been accused of being crazy for your devotion to Jesus? Has anything we've done or tried or said for the sake of Christ cut deeply enough to make a difference such that the world looks at us and our faith and said, that'll never work, that's crazy. But for Jesus, they'd be right. Let's all invite Jesus to speak to us about these things in just a few moments of silence here as we prepare to come to his table. This is a family table, and we come in response to his grace. So, Lord, anything that you'd like to say to us about our loyalties, where they lie, you're welcome to say to us here in just this moment or two of silence. We will listen for you.